All right, I think we should get started. Make sure everything's here. Well, thank you all for attending this conversation. My name is Marc Diaz. I'm with Chicago Arts Partnerships and Education. And this is our second artisan dialogue session. We started this because we wanted to have more conversations with everyone. And of course, we're all still under some type of quarantine. So this would be a good way to have conversations around arts practice and education. We will have a few of these. So if a few more of these, probably like once a month. So just stay tuned and just look out for other invitations to artist conversations, dialogue coming soon. So I'm super excited to introduce these two artists, I hope that after their conversations, we can participate in more of a dialogue and to get a better idea about their own work and other things going on around education, collective organization, and print media. So we have with us Marc Fischer. Marc Fischer is the administrator of Public Collectors, initiative formed in 2007. Public Collectors aims to encourage greater access to scholarship and marginal cultural materials, particularly those that museums ignore. Public Collectors' work includes the Library Excavations publication series and web project, the blog and publication series Hardcore Architecture about underground music in America, and Malachi Ritscher, a project about the late Chicago documentarian and activist produced for the 2014 Whitney Biennial. In addition to Public Collectors, Fischer is a member of the group Temporary Services, founded in 1998, and a partner in its publishing imprint, Half Letter Press. Temporary Services and Half Letter Press have produced over 125 publications, and Fischer has created nearly 45 publications under Public Collectors. And then we also have Nicholas Wylie. He's an artist and organizer based in Chicago. He's managing director of Public Media Institute, which he'll tell us more about. From 2015 to 2018, he served as associate director of Southern Exposure, a 45-year-old artist-run nonprofit in San Francisco. In 2006, he co-founded Herald Arts, a Chicago-based nonprofit arts organization with a residency in Ohio, and was its co-director till 2010. He co-founded ACRE, Artist Cooperative Residency and Exhibitions, which programs exhibitions in a Pilsen Gallery and a residency in rural Wisconsin. While he also served as a gallery as a co-director in ACRE until moving to San Francisco and joining its board of directors in 2015. Wylie is founding artistic director of Mana Contemporary, an artist space in Pilsen from 2012 to 2015. He has taught art making and administration at Chicago High School for the Arts, Art Institute of Chicago, U of I at Chicago, and the University of St. Francis. He is an artist, and his practice investigates queer time travel through video, technology, performance, and drawing. So I believe we have Mark will go first. Is that right?
Sure. Okay, well, thank you, Mark. Thanks so much, Cape, for organizing this. For people joining who are not aware of Cape's work, I really recommend learning about the range of things they do, and also just wanted to say they've been tremendously supportive of their teaching artists, of which I am one, during the pandemic, which is just very meaningful. So I'm going to talk about two publishing projects. One that I was working on right up until COVID-19 visited our lives, and then work from the past 4 months that I started during the pandemic. So I'll talk about these two different projects. I'm going to go into, and these are both from my ongoing project, Public Collectors. I'm going to go into share screen and just show this slideshow and talk over it. So this is a project I started about 2 years ago, and it's what I call a meal-based artist residency program, where I bring an artist, where basically we share a meal together, and then have a discussion. So the structure of this was that artists could apply, basically artists in any creative discipline, to have a courtroom artist residency. And the structure of this is that I would pick the person up, usually at around 8:30 in the morning, or if they were visiting from another city. Sometimes people stayed at my house, but most of the residents were local. And the structure of the day was that I would pick the person up, we would drive to criminal court on 2650 South California in Chicago, and we would observe usually the entire morning session court. And after that, we would go to Taqueria El Milagro, have a discussion, record a conversation about what we just experienced, eat delicious food, and then I would transcribe that conversation, edit it with the artist, and every 4 people, there would be a new publication. This was the first booklet, which is called the Courtroom Artist Residency Report. For this particular booklet, on the cover, in addition to the remnants of our food, there's the cover of my note-taking booklet, which in this case I actually wasn't allowed to bring into court because we were observing the post-trial motions from the Jason Van Dyke trial, ex-CPD officer who was convicted of second-degree murder. Some of the first residents, usually I would do this about once a month, so in between residencies, I would be transcribing and editing, and usually by the time that was done, it was time to go back to court with a different person. In one case, Wes Jans actually attended 2 days of court because he drove up from Indiana. We were observing Jason Van Dyke's trial. The booklets then consist of, sometimes there are pages of notes that the resident took. Usually I write some kind of an introduction and then a transcription of our conversation. Some people would actually do things that looked like artwork in court. Dmitry Samarov makes enormous amounts of drawings from life. That's sort of his normal way of working. He actually finds that drawing and helps kind of so he spent time drawing, but also really took in everything that was happening. In some cases, we might visit 5 or 6 different courtrooms in 3 hours. A lot of times what would happen is either a judge shows up 45 minutes late, or the court goes on recess and you have no idea how long they're going to be on recess. It could be 5 minutes, it could be 45 minutes. Sometimes we would wait it out, sometimes we wouldn't. Sometimes it just didn't seem like very much was happening. Sometimes also almost all of the cases were heard, and then we were in this awkward situation of being the only people in the courtroom that didn't have a case. and it starts becoming kind of strange to the judge and personnel why people are there who don't have a reason to be in court, because very, very few people observe court unless it's something quite newsworthy, just to see how the system works and how it functions or doesn't function. You can't bring any electronic devices into court, so any photos usually happen outside. You can't bring a phone into court. You certainly can't bring a camera or a computer. This was from, during Jason Van Dyke's trial, they would give you these spectator stickers. Spectator always feels like really the wrong word. But this is a remnant from when Josh Rios and I went to Jason Van Dyke's sentencing hearing, which was the longest residency. We were in court from about 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night. And then had like Snickers bars from the snack stand for lunch before having a dinner afterward at about 6:30. The photos on the cover often show kind of scenes from around the court. This is the back of a Popeyes and law office across the street from the court building. The introduction to Josh Rios's residency. A detail from the outside of the court, the exterior architecture. This was the last booklet, which I published. I guess this was around February. This came out. This cover looks like some kind of crazy photo montage, but this is actually this parking booth that's directly across from the court building. It's just this incredible ramshackle structure. So that was what I was working on. I actually had a residency scheduled for March 13th, right when everything was shutting down, and the person who was going to be a resident, Laura Schaefer from Compound Yellow in Oak Park, had to cancel because she got called into her job. And then as I saw how everything was going, it was clear that like this just should not happen. Like and I don't even know if it was possible to go to court. And now there's no visiting that building. It's really quite fascinating. If you go on YouTube and search for Layton Criminal Court, Leighton, you can watch court live on YouTube. It's not archived. And usually there are several different courtrooms that you can watch at any given time. But you know, the defendants, if they're in custody, are on Zoom from Cook County Jail. Their lawyers are usually in their homes. The court reporters are also in their homes. The prosecuting attorney, you know, could be in his or her kitchen. So you see all these home interiors, but the judge is actually in the court building. It's really interesting. I really recommend checking that out. Search for Layton Criminal Court. So that brought us to, so that was March 13th. And then by March 15th, by that time I realized I needed to figure out, there were just a lot of things I was working on that I couldn't do. Teaching was on hold. Working for CAPE, we weren't able to do anything for quite some time before CPS loosened the reins on how teaching artists could work with CPS teachers, that we could join classes or after school programs on Google Meets with the teacher present. So I started a new project called QUARANZINE. I've since seen many, many things referred to as QUARANZINEs. I think someone else was using this word for a graphic novel before the pandemic. I think it was just kind of a shared epiphany that this would be a nice name for a publication produced during the pandemic. And I have a lot of love for like one-page fanzines where it's just a double-sided sheet of paper, or it's, whoa, I've been talking too long. Or a folded in half sheet of paper. So each issue of this is one piece of paper printed on both sides on the Risograph duplicator in my basement. First issue is photos of worms from my backyard compost pile. I was digging around, things were starting to thaw, and they were all writhing around in there, totally oblivious to the pandemic. By the second issue, everything was collaborative, which was my intention, to not just have my own reflections, but publish other people. So this was Laura Stempel, who lives in Chicago, reflecting on living alone and dealing with depression during the pandemic and her fears about getting through this. My friend Doro Boyum passed away unrelated to the virus on March 20th. And this was the first instance of someone I knew dying during this period and not being able to have a memorial service of any kind because of the virus. Drawings by Berwyn, not Chicago, Berwyn-based artist Paul Nudd of Iron Lungs. So some people could use this just for drawings about breathing and air systems by Caitlin Costas. Also, then I started actively trying to include children. This is by Aubrey Fisher, who, no relation to me, who made drawings describing his day in school on Zoom, which I think is just incredibly accurate description experience. This was like kind of activity page for children that I created in Google using patent application drawings of different mask designs. Another educational aspect of this, Kirsten Linares had been working with students in Milwaukee and wanted to collaborate with one of her past students. So she actually sent her student Iman Fatmi interview questions, which and then we printed Iman's artwork alongside her answers. The murder of George Floyd, of course, started to dominate people's thinking for some time, and QUARANZINE also could kind of adjust and flex in that moment. Did not have to stay focused on the pandemic for every single issue. It was really about what people were creating during this period. This was an issue that I wrote, although there's no need or mention of authorship. So this is the front of the issue, and then when you flip it over, that's the back. As protests and response began happening, I wanted to include people who were participating in that. This is by a Chicago artist, an account of the protests in downtown Chicago on May 30th, written by Alexander Richard Wilson, Chicago artist. This was published the day after his account of a protest from the night before. So I printed 100 issues of this project. There was a new issue every day. When I missed a day, I would make 2 issues another day. This is by Shuri Sims. Shuri is a student of an old professor of mine from undergrad in Pittsburgh, Suzanne Slavic. And Suzanne connected me with Shuri, and then I included her participation and worked directly with Shuri, not with her professor that way. So I was collaborating with other people's students. A bunch of people participated that I've never met before. And I'll just end really quickly. These are photos of some of how the issues were distributed. I started using things that were in alleys as supports for posting issues. Some infrastructure, things like this. These nice smooth metal surfaces are great for taping things to. This is a issue by Chris Kerr. I sent him a picture and said, "Chris, I saw your work on TV." Dumpster is also a very helpful surface for sharing things. And this was one of the last presentations, 18 different issues, utilizing a chain link fence at a park 2 blocks from my house in Avondale. Also bus benches, very nice surface. So the project has ended. I made 100 issues. It made me become nice and behind on lots of other things I was working on. But it was a really incredible way to include the participation of a lot of people in a very short period of time, and get to have these really great, quick collaborations. So I'll stop here and hand it over to Nick, who I also collaborated with on a different project, which he'll talk about during this time.
Hi, I'm Nick Wylie. I'm going to give a short presentation on the work that Public Media Institute does, but specifically a lot of the stuff that we've been doing since quarantine, and especially the quarantine times, which was inspired by the work that Marc did on the QUARANZINE, and he was an editor of. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. So, so Public Media Institute is headquartered in this building in Bridgeport in Chicago, which is called Co-Prosperity. Recently, this is like a soft announce, we're changing the name from Co-Prosperity Sphere to Co-Prosperity. This is like a little diagram that a MFA from SAIC, an architect, made last year, so it's like easier to sort of explain what it is. With this, there's a radio station in the front of the space called WLPN. We publish magazines from upstairs in this office, Lumpen and otherwise. And then the main space, Co-Prosperity, has a lot of exhibitions and events and concerts, or it used to. And so what used to be this sort of like hub of all of our activity has now been like locked up. Like 150 people probably had the keys. We finally had to change them because people are so used to just coming to the space and using it, that we wanted to keep it safe. And it was really a bummer that we had to change the keys for the first time in 20 years. But we tried to pivot is one of the words in the description of this talk. So Lumpen Radio, right? Almost all the shows are recorded in the studio. So I'll back up a little bit. So Public Media Institute includes Lumpen Radio, which is the radio station, which launched about 4 years ago. And then the magazine Lumpen launched about 30 years ago. In between, in the early 2000s, the collective of people who were making this magazine that's distributed freely all over the city and beyond, moved into the Co-Prosperity Space and Art Center in Bridgeport. The radio station is the most recent thing, but then we also will have, launching next month, a fourth pillar, shall we say, of the organization, which will be called Buddy, and it's a shop for artist-made things in Chicago that will kind of open soft at the Cultural Center, which is planning on reopening its doors to 25% capacity in early August. We're also launching a website for that. So we had all these things underway, a million exhibitions. We would usually have like on average 2 exhibitions a month. This was the group of people who started things at Buddy in Wicker Park before moving to Co-Prosperity. This is what the space used to look like when it had art in it. We would also do a lot of offsite things in public. So this was with Maria Gaspar and the radio station in her 96 Acres project, where we broadcast the audio and she projected the video of animations made by Cook County folks. So I thought that was like a Marc related thing. This is what Lumpen can look like. This is the radio studio that is now empty. We can't have people, even if they go one at a time, filling that space. We are sort of working with the HVAC to try to make it come back. This is Logan Bay on the right and Ed Marzuski on the left there, to be credited for starting the radio station. Edmar started Co-Prosperity and PMI and Lumpen about 30 years ago. This is his mom, Maria. So that we have these 4 pillars: the radio station, the gallery, the magazine, and now this shop at the Cultural Center. But then there are also like 3 or 4 flying buttresses, organizations that are outside of the nonprofit, but support us and historically have in different ways. That all started with Maria's. This is Ed's mom, Maria, and she ran a bar for many years down the street from the space that was called Kaplan's, and they sort of transformed it from this kind of old divey bar to Maria's. She bought the business, and they opened another space next to it called Kimski, which is Korean Polish fusion food. And so Kimski and Maria's will help us get food and beer and drinks to our events, and we help bring people to the neighborhood to come and be hungry and go and eat a Korean Polish. The magazine is distributed at all those spaces. These are examples of some of the more recent magazines. Okay, so can't have anyone in the space, and so I'm just going to walk through some of the like pivots that we did. So this is one of the more recent ones, an exhibition of basically protest signs curated by Monica Trinidad and Just Seeds. Monica is just, as of like last week, a new member of the Just Seeds Collective, which is an international group of poster makers and printmakers that usually are working along social justice lines. So you can see there that we have the Black Lives Matter demands at the end, and then over 80 artists and their different posters. We also commissioned a neon artist that we work with often, Neon Mike, to make these 4 signs that are in the corner window. Like, we can still continue exhibiting in the window is what I'm trying to say, not just the, we can't let people in space yet, or we've decided not to. So this says, I can't jog, I can't kneel, I can't watch birds, I can't breathe. There's the radio station again. There's Ed. So, okay, so right, so this is supposed to cue me to say, backing up, that like while people haven't been in the radio station, we have actually seen an uptick in radio content production. So it's a 24-hour FM live stream, or FM over the airs channel. It's 105.5 WLPN. You can get it on lumpenradio.com, or we have 2 apps, an Android and Apple app if you're not in Chicago. But right, we can't use the studio. All the people who've run the studio and the shows have been super like sound nerds about things forever, and they want the quality to be perfect. But once COVID hit, some of those discerning audio quality concerns left, and we started to allow people to pre-record from home, and now we're recording live now from people's homes as well, and developing the technology as we go. But it's been 4 months of production from people's homes, and because they don't have to like commute to the station anymore, or for whatever reasons, because there's a lot of urgent things to talk about, there is now more content on Lumpen Radio than ever. The other thing that we did, in sort of in the tradition of the publishing side of the nonprofit, and inspired by Marc's work, we established the Quarantine Times, which you can reach at quarantinetimes.org. I might share the screen of the website, but it's just so much stuff that it's a little hard to describe everything that goes on with the Quarantine Times. But we launched it about 2 weeks after the shelter in place, maybe even a week. And this is just a view where you can see a lot of the content as it loads. The structure that we went with was, we had a weekly rotation of editors. So like every Monday, Juan Kim, who is the chef at Kimski, would select a creative. Usually he would work with restaurant workers who were out of jobs to make a contribution. So there would be 1 feature a day. So Juan Kim would be Mondays. Stephanie Manriquez, who I think is embarrassingly on the call, would be Tuesdays. We would have Marc Fischer, who is present, as you met. Wednesdays, Thursdays were Mairead Case. Fridays were Christy Master. Saturdays were Jeremiah Chu and Brandon Alvendia. And then Sundays were a rotation of the artists who comprise the Co-Prosperity Programming Council, or the CoPro-Proco. They would each submit something on a given Sunday. I'm talking about it in the past tense because that format lasted for 3 months. We got funded for 3 months of those 7 editors to produce and work with a different artist or creative to make a creative response to the pandemic. And we were happy to be able to redistribute funds from various foundations and individuals who wanted to support artists in the pandemic. And so every artist who was selected by one of those editors got a $500 stipend for their work. And then the editors were also able to be compensated. As part of the Quarantine Times, and okay, so that 3-month run is over, but we continue to publish things. So you maybe saw the Lori Waxman series of interviews with artists or kind of reviews of their work during COVID. We still have budget to compensate at $200 people who solicit us to participate in the Quarantine Times. We don't have a ton of capacity to edit as much as we used to, but we're still publishing until we run out of money. And we're going to keep getting content out there. One of the things that we published last week was a poem by a woman, Big Mama, who works with Redline Services, who are a nonprofit run by Rhoda Rosen and Billy McGinnis, who work with people with lived experiences of homelessness. And so we're going to start to publish more of the, the contributions from that partnership. Another thing that happened as part of the quarantine times, especially working with Brandon Alvendia and Jeremiah Chu, was that we wanted to continue to support the musicians that we work with that usually have concerts at the Co-Prosperity space. And so we launched the Twitch channel. And so Lumpen Radio Twitch became a site for at least bi-weekly concerts from artists from all over the country and world. You may have seen Experimental Sound Studios quarantine concert series. We worked with them closely to figure out different ways that we could support performing artists in these ways. It also happened to be that we started, like when the protests started happening, we were restreaming those. And then we've also been sending people out into protests with equipment to stream protests in Chicago. We also just recently started a project. So I mentioned that a lot of the for-profit service industry, I didn't mention Mars. There's Maria's, the bar, Kimski, the restaurant, and then Mars is a brewery that is founded by Ed Marzuski as well. And they are able to help us usually like with special beers for different exhibitions and et cetera. But right now, all of those businesses are pretty much shuttered. They've taken a huge hit by COVID. Many of their employees are on unemployment. And so one of the things we wanted to do, or we came up with, was this community kitchen idea. And so as the nonprofit sort of partner of them, we're finally able to sort of support them in ways that they've supported us before by seeking and finding funding to distribute free meals made by the chefs at these businesses and other guest chefs to, originally it was 200 meals a day, and now we just bumped up to 300 meals a day, and we are gonna go through the end of the year. So we work with local farms and local chefs and food workers to make these healthy chef-prepared meals. Right now it's every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but we're expanding. The meals go out to public housing spaces in partnership with the National Public Housing Museum, low-income senior housing. On Wednesdays, we just distribute them, or a portion of them, to just Bridgeport residents who are walking by or have started to know that they can come and get these free meals. And so that's a sort of way that we are able to work with our partnerships that already exist to continue to expand, or like to keep people working and to keep them working for a good cause during the emergency pandemic. I'll also just quickly note, I might be close to out of time. I don't have the chat pulled up, but Stephanie Mariquez is also on the call, and Anita Luke. We're all poised to do this big amplification of the multilingual content on Lumpen Radio by training new Cantonese and Chinese speaking producers to make more radio. So while they're not able to have those classes, which were set to be had, like in the space this summer, they're doing it remotely. They continue to produce shows like Contratiempo and Tete a Tete, and are training new producers to make radio. What's interesting is, this is like a whole nother can of worms, but as we're producing more Twitch and we're starting to build up the capacity to become sort of not just a radio station, but kind of like an online TV station, various arts organizations are coming to us, and we're partnering and working with them to help some of their programming still exist that would otherwise maybe not be able to happen because it was all planned to be physical. So for instance, one of the things that's happening is that in partnership with Contratiempo and Stephanie Manriquez and the multilingual program, and as well as Yollocalli, which Stephanie works with youth there to train them in radio. They're doing a summer internship, and one of the artists that they're now getting to work with is Guillermo Gomez Pena, who was set to do a project with the Smart Museum and for the 40th anniversary of the MacArthur Fellowship, but now is stuck at home just like them and us. And so the youth radio folks and Stephanie are working with Guillermo's long-term practice and engagement with radio, teaching him along with us how to set up a video studio in his home and working with his audio archive. And so they're kind of getting to work together in ways that maybe wouldn't have otherwise happened outside of COVID. So I just like, these are shots of Guillermo that I was introducing to the students last week. So there's a lot more, but I'm eager to get into conversation with Mark, but those are the thrusts of the main things we're doing. I'll just say the one other thing that I forgot to mention, I haven't shown images of the buddy space or anything. It's too much to pack in. But one other thing that we were able to sort of secure as COVID aid is that while the buddy shop at the Cultural Center was going to be like a 60-40 split between the artists and the nonprofit to keep it going, we managed to get funding from a number of partners to make sure that during the quarantine time, during COVID, at least through the end of the year, all of the proceeds from the sales of Buddy work is going to go to the artists 100%. So Buddy 100. And one way that, like, even though we're not open yet, you can come to the parking lot if you're in Chicago behind Mars, to these community markets that we're doing every Sunday. And there is a Buddy shop there that holds, like, you know, some small percentage of the hundreds of artists that we're working with in the eventual shop. So you can buy works from them there, and there will be an online shop soon. And when you're at the market, you can also shop from some of the local farms that we're working with as part of Community Kitchen. It's a very, like, low capacity farmers market, basically, or market. But the conceit is that if and when the, like, people who are producing a bunch of greens or proteins in Chicago don't sell all of their wares at the market each Sunday, then Community Kitchen Project will buy up the rest of them and incorporate those foods into their meals. So I don't know, I'm ending with a photo of Guillermo Gomez Peña, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm happy to talk about any of those projects. I didn't do any of them justice, but I was trying to keep time, and I'm nervous. And hi.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Mark. Great intros to your work. And I do have some questions for you. And audience, please use the chat for any comments or questions you might have. And Brandon and I will kind of check that every once in a while and weave into the conversation. So my first question is for both of you, and it really, it's really about my curiosity and just kind of curiosity about an arts practice, if you could unpack that, but also thinking about in relation to the different projects that you work in. Like, you work in projects that work through systems of information, systems of economy, systems of justice. Your projects work in communities, and your projects also intersect. So can you talk a little bit more about the actual nature of your artistic practice in relation to those complex systems that you do?
Do you want to go first, Mark?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's definitely, I mean, I think both these practices are highly collaborative and very openly collaborative. I think that the two projects I showed really highlighted that quite clearly. And I think with going to court, you know, with other artists, it was really about kind of learning together at the same time. I'm not trained in law. The people that participated were not trained in law. So we were both there to really kind of try to make sense of it together. Also just kind of trying to, you know, there's the sort of administrative side of what I do, but also trying to get rid of hierarchy as much as possible so that former students, current students can be collaborators. I was teaching grad school at Columbia College while this was going on, and several of my students, completely unrelated to what class was about, came to me and said, I really want to do an issue of QUARANZINE. So, you know, like, I think other people might have had a barrier where they'd say, oh, well, I can't do that because you're my student and we have to wait until you graduate and, you know, whatever, you know, and I don't really observe that kind of separation. So it was like, sure, you can take this class that has nothing to do with this and collaborate with me at the same time. You know, friends, there were like 4-year-olds who made issues of QUARANZINE with the help of their parents. And, you know, I couldn't really get the 4-year-old on a Zoom chat or something. So I would just, you know, ask the parents, like, find out what, you know, color paper and ink they want, or can you show this PDF to them and see if they're happy with the way it looks or if there's anything that should be done differently. And, you know, some kids said, like, I want red ink on blue paper, which looks really kind of noxious, and I'm like, yeah, let's do it. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, all of these things blur together, and I don't try to make any sort of neat containers for much of anything. I think all of the projects have their own clear parameters, but there's kind of a lot that can happen within them. The range of artists that came to court with me was extremely broad. There were, you know, musicians, poets, you know, educators, sculptors, not just people that you would just sort of expect would be interested in socially engaged art, but people who were looking, you know, to have that experience and see what they would get from that and what they could bring to it, and just kind of apply their attention in that direction for a day and see what happened. You know.
Yeah, cool. I was gonna come out with my sort of like political, or I don't know. I think that the collaborative and non-hierarchical thing is good. Like, I think that mainly in the practice of my work at PMI, I try to maintain an administrator's stance, like through residency work and all these things. Like, I like to be collaborative in the production of things, and I love that, you know, sort of Marc's work to frame and lay out the contributions in QUARANZINE made for a kind of a collaborative, at least compositional practice. I sort of am kind of a diehard, like, artist-run spaces mean that they're, and projects mean that they're artists who are running them, and so I kind of think it's a cop-out to say that my practice artistically is this work, right? I guess I don't begrudge anyone who calls their job and administration work creative practice. I like that, but I see a lot of people who had an artistic practice then like become monks or nuns for art, and sort of like serving other artists, which is all I want to do. But all the people who I work with at Public Media Institute, I'm like thrilled to see when they have their own artistic projects that happen. And those sometimes are presented by PMI, but that's also a conflict. So I don't know where exactly I'm going with this, or if it answers your question at all, Marc, but like my practice involves like queer history, and like I'm gonna go to the gravesite of Abraham Lincoln's lover tomorrow and like take some pictures and like do some weird stuff with that. And it doesn't ever have to be in quarantine times. But I think that, I think in all kind of nonprofit and justice work, like it's important for the people who are trying to take care to support the needs of the constituencies are like members of, or have representative members of those constituencies making decisions. And so, yeah, I don't know, that's a little arcane of an answer to that question, but yeah.
I'm seeing there's a question from Amy Rasmussen. I'd be happy to.
Yeah, so there's a question for Amy about what idea or question struck your idea for the courtroom project?
So I've done a fair amount of work with people in prison. The group I'm part of, Temporary Services, had a very long-running collaboration with an artist named Angelo, who was incarcerated. When I lived in Pittsburgh in undergrad, I was a volunteer visiting artist at maximum security penitentiary that since has been torn down, Western Penitentiary. So I'd seen the kind of prison side of that work, but had only ever been to court for jury duty, and I don't get picked for juries. I've been questioned a couple times. They did not want me. And I had been doing this meal-based residency where I would bring artists to, if artists lived outside of Chicago, I would take them out to lunch at Jungbu Market to their snack counter as a kind of just gesture of like opening a conversation or exchange. And that was fun for the 36 times that I did that, but it also felt like it had kind of run its course. I needed to do something more complicated. The courtroom residency was inspired by going to the pretrial hearings for Jason Van Dyke's trial. And when I went to those pretrial hearings, there would usually be, it was very striking, the difference between thousands of people being in the streets for protests around his murder of Laquan McDonald, and then going to court and there being maybe only 12 or 15 activists in the room, but you could sort of tell who was an activist. And when there was a recess or something, often I would chat with the people I was sitting next to. And a lot of people there had much more experience going to court than I did. So they could answer these questions I had and were super helpful and very generous and thoughtful. And there's one day I went to court, and as happens often, there was some technicality. Someone wasn't there, or someone couldn't get some documentation they needed. So the court, after 5 minutes, the court went on recess until the entire next day. And I had just driven down there and spent like an hour in traffic. And I'm like, well, I'm not like just going home now. So, there are about 20 different courtrooms at least in that building. So I started just visiting other courtrooms. And I quickly realized that when you go to a different room where nothing extraordinary is happening except something that just affects the entire course of a person's life, that there aren't people there to watch and try to understand what's happening. The only other people there are people that are either waiting to have their case heard, or they're waiting to see their loved one who's in custody for 5 seconds when they come out to see the judge. So it occurred to me, like in that moment, that this should be the next residency project. I should go with other artists so that I have someone there, so that we can both watch this and talk about it and try to understand it. Because like incredibly subtle, complicated things happen in like 15 seconds or 30 seconds. I'll give one really fast example. I was in court with someone, and a defendant came out wearing their Department of Corrections uniform. And on the back of the uniform, it says DOC, right? Department of Corrections. And someone had changed the C in corrections to a G. So this person stood in front of the judge with like the word dog displayed to everyone in the court. And, I have no idea like how that gets to happen, right? So did the person do it themselves, like as a joke? Did a staff person do that so that they would be humiliated in front of the court? Like these are the kinds of complicated things that happen in like seconds that I would then have conversations with the residents about. And it's, so that's how I started doing that.
Great.
And there were 16 of those residencies before I had to stop, so.
I wanted to just go back a bit on some points that you and Nick made about the work that you're doing, points about like, learning together, getting rid of hierarchy and collaborations. I was wondering like more thoughts about this kind of intersection of like art making in this public way, and there's elements of skill sharing and resource sharing. So there's this like educative intersections. And can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that? Like your kind of thoughts about like these more educational modes within your practice, either as administrator or arts practitioner or artist?
Mm-hmm. I could go a little bit and go fast because Mark, I think you have more of an education or specifically CAPE relevant to education experience. But one of the things that's been interesting, especially with reference to like things like we're doing right now, is that a lot of people are kind of like learning in tandem. And so we were lucky to be working with Brandon Albendia, who like basically spent a year of his practice running up to the quarantine, not anticipating that it was happening, learning about Twitch and the cultures of Twitch and the different technologies. And so as a founding member of our programming council, he had already sort of proposed that we were going to try to start a Twitch studio in the basement of Co-Prosperity. And so when the COVID hit, we were sort of already a little bit head started, and he was able to educate us like through doing a lot of the initial programming that we did via Twitch, like the concerts, yes, but also we worked with like Common Field, which is an organization of artist-run organizations and artist-centered organizations that was going to have a conference, but it couldn't have it in person in Houston. So we were able to help them connect to some learning around like how to host a conference in virtual space. And then we participated in it, and like to this collaborative, and Brandon Alvendia and I just sort of engaged a lot of the artist run spaces in Chicago and had them kind of like present and talk through like in a 40-person Zoom that was sort of like game show inflected by Brandon, how they were dealing with COVID in the early days, and sort of talking about their projects in general. And then sort of like a lot of people who participated in that wanted to know more about how to present themselves. And so Jeremiah Chu, who is more on the concert side, and is a designer, put together this amazing document about how to launch your own Twitch stream and do creative work inside that space, which, right, Twitch TV, Lumpen Radio. But not only like the democratic or horizontal thing maybe was that, yeah, this was like, yeah, we signed up for a Twitch account, but anyone can. And here's a guide of what we've learned so far and how to do it yourself. That has sort of, there was so much like co-learning there, and we're still learning so much, and we still haven't like made the studio proper in our space. So the goal is now, I think I saw a question about like the sort of prevailing things that will continue to happen maybe post-COVID as well. Our goal in seeing that the Twitch was and has been like audiovisual broadcasts have been useful when we're all in shelter in place, has been to think about how it will continue to be useful after that moment, and thinking about accessibility, audiences that are beyond the local, et cetera. And sort of in conversation with a lot of the organizations of our size that are in like the performing arts world, like theater and dance and other music presenters, they're sort of even more devastated than some of the visual arts worlds, and having a lot of trouble sort of making steps to try to convey, like, for instance, theatrical performance in an adequate way. So we're working with some partners to develop more technology and more expertise on our team, so that we can get to a place pretty soon where we can offer more like formal trainings for those organizations to bring up their own sort of capacity for that sort of thing. And if they don't want to just like provide that service for them, they can, like, we will have like a sound stage that they can come and do stuff at, and then we can sort of like maybe give them a clean dry run of what might be something that they want to take up in their spaces. Of course there's also like education wise, all these people who contributed to the Quarantine Times, like William Estrada, who was in Cape's last presentation, who really had some profound and poetic sort of responses to teaching online and all that's happened there. I taught at Shy Arts last year, and the shift was dramatic, but I think there were a lot of I hesitate to say this in an education space, but I thought that there were a lot of things that came out in our Google Hangouts conversations that might not have in the classroom, and the sort of way that I related to the students felt different and exciting. On the other hand, like Nicole Marquine, who is also a contributor to Quarantine Times, like really sees devastating futures in the adoption of all online education. And so I'm wary of those things. I just have a little bit of techno-optimism, and I think that even not in quarantine space, some of these platforms can be really useful to engage audiences that we don't normally bring out to physical spaces. And I think that part of that is like, especially like rural-urban divide is an interesting space for like educating and getting media out. And that is something we try to do with the radio as well. So I don't know. I've just been in the country a lot the last two weeks, and seeing all the Trump and QAnon signs and stuff, I just feel like that sort of access to culture and education that isn't present in rural space is something that maybe some of these technologies, as we learn them together, can mitigate.
Mark, did you have a response?
I think Nick did a good job. I'm looking at these other questions also, and like how long it would take you to answer them.
Let's start with a question from Scott. There are a couple of others below that, but what new possibilities might you see or wonder about as the pandemic situation continues in whatever form or in its aftermath? And Nick kind of talked a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, part of this for me is not a radical change from how I normally I'm in my basement, like many waking hours of my day, working on things with other people who are not physically present. So the shift of like collaborating with people over email, not even picking up the phone, not using video chat, not using any of those things, just sending communication, writing back and forth or files back and forth. For me as a way of working, that's really, that's totally normal. But the lack of in-person connection that, at least in like a publishing sphere, but also a teaching sphere, is really difficult. Normally I would probably participate in 12 book fairs a year, where you spend, like, I'd sort of shifted my practice, where I was doing less exhibiting and more participating in events. So instead of, because I think at some point I realized, when you have an exhibit, you maybe travel to another place and you spend days with practically no people setting something up. You have an opening where you talk to people intensely for 3 hours, and then you go away and you have no idea how it's received or what happens. With a book fair, it's like the opposite. You spend like an hour setting up, and then you spend 30 hours talking to people continuously over the course of several days, and you develop these friendships and relationships that that continue for decades, like in my experience. And it's very powerful and very moving, and these people become like friends you see as you come back to these places, and you sleep on their couch and all these things happen. So that lack of the physical connection, or the idea of, it was one thing teaching in college students that I had already spent 6 or 7 weeks with in person. So at least we had that before we went into remote learning. From a teaching standpoint, I'm very concerned about developing relationships with students and really understanding their work and their personalities and their quirks and, their passions, like trying to do that over Zoom without ever having the opportunity to meet them in person potentially is really concerning. The idea of like recruiting new students for after school programs, I have no idea how that will work. I'm hoping that it's like what people who have to wear a mask 8 hours a day talk about, like getting used to it. And I've done that for maybe like 40 minutes at a time because I don't go out of the house very often. So hopefully like Zoom will feel like mask wearing at some point, but I kind of doubt it. I'm not really expecting to get comfortable with this. So I think that figuring out these remote strategies that I've used for other things is, but applied to other areas could be quite important.
Mm-hmm.
I'm mostly just worried that the post office like continues, because if that completely fails, that shuts down a whole enormous avenue of distribution of the things that I make with other people.
Nick, did you want to add anything?
I'll do the same thing and think that Mark answered that pretty well. And we can move on.
Well, there's obviously there's a lot of like curiosities that are like questions around like what are the shifts or possibilities out there. I'm also looking at I think it's William's question here. How do you see your practice or work interrupting traditional models of making, working, or collaborating? And how do you see the way you make or collaborate as a resource or model for educators? So yeah, because I think we actually had that little conversation too about like some of your work is not so much about like giving a resource, but it is kind of like a resource in itself. Mm-hmm. So yeah, can you guys?
Well, I think that QUARANZINE was similar to publishing projects I've done in through CAPE with high school students, in that it created a printed space for the concerns of other people. I designed a basic template that everything fit into, and there were certain limits, like I'm not going to add a second piece of paper each issue gets one color, like no one gets anything special, no matter how famous, or not famous they are or whatever. But what people do with that space was incredibly open, and working with high school kids. If the kids want to make a zine about the band BTS, and want me to interview them so that we can all learn together, what this culture is, I'm totally open to that, because probably that is the thing that they will make their best work about. It's what they're really passionate about. Trying to guide, provide some outside critical perspective. And of course, I'm also playing editor and proofreader, and trying to figure out whether people's content will make sense to a larger audience, and what it needs and more of, and what it needs less of. But really just sort of being available to help people refine their ideas, and and sort of giving them, I guess some tools, but also kind of stepping out of the way and not trying to overly determine what the work should be.
I think it's really important, Mark, that a lot of your education that I've sort of heard you talk about now, or the engagement with QUARANZINE, is that what you're giving is platform and audience too. That, I don't know, when I was teaching Shy Arts class last year, we did a lot of work that was sort of part of the syllabus that I inherited, that was all about, sort of professional development and getting them ready for college, and showing them certain kinds of practices and how different practices operate in the world. But as soon as we started getting to the point, we were also working towards an exhibition of their work that never happened. But right before the exhibition, we just made a zine together, and that's when half of the students that weren't maybe that engaged in anything that wasn't pertaining to them, or they weren't having output that they knew was going to be seen by others, were sort of activated, and I started to learn more about their interests, and they were way more engaged with the class. And of course, the quarantine happened right the day that we were supposed to have the zines in class and finally get to look at the product of all their work and stuff, but they got it digitally. I guess just that sort of platforming thing, the making sure that there's an audience for the work that's being done. I think that the much better example than my clunky Shy Arts class is Yola Kali, and Stephanie Manriquez is working with youth to do a weekly radio show, right? They're learning, but they're also there is that pressure. It's any artist knows that they're going to work much differently and harder, and seek out that feedback that you're talking about, Mark, a lot more as they're making, if there's a deadline coming up for an exhibition or something, right? And so that on air, liveness that they have to go on any minute, that kind of education, the learning and doing, and the sort of dissemination of the power in the space to the students. They're the producers, and we're just working to highlight what they're doing. It's a support structure as opposed to a top-down pedagogical model or something. And so I don't know, in general, sometimes students are going to have opportunities to exhibit what they're doing, but in the standard practices. But I think the question was about sort of dismantling some of those. If there's not a forum or a publication or an online space for the work that your students are doing, why not just make one? And that's its own education. And I think that a lot of what Mark does, and a lot of the artists that I respect doing artist-run cultural things, is just make their own platforms, and teaching students that they can do that and it's accessible by sort of working on a platform together, and the content for it is, I think, rad and important. Yeah.
And Cape does this. I mean, Cape organizes exhibits and foregrounds, the work that 18 artists and collaborators do with students. It gets out into the world. When I make publications with high school students, we don't make 10 copies so that everyone in the class gets one and no one else sees it. We make 100 or 200 or 500 copies in some cases. Right. And I'll include those publications. If people mail order other things I've made, I'll throw those Cape publications in with those orders, so they go to other cities or other countries, and the students have an audience for their work that they could not have imagined. I mean, like when I was in high school, like there was no emphasis ever on public exhibition of any kind. You know, the teachers never worked on anything like that. In college, it barely happened either.
Yeah.
So, or grad school, for that matter.
Yeah.
So there's like nothing at stake, you know.
Right.
And,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which also what's curious about both of your works in that there's that analog distribution that had existed before, but then it's just kind of expanded through the quarantine. Like there seems to be like more of it, where there's different ways that you and your collaborators are figuring out how to distribute the material online. Right, that's how I'm understanding it. And I'm actually kind of looking at Michael Dola's comment about exhibition in some respects, right? A display of the work. In New York City, other than Window, a lot of graffiti being produced on the board up in stores post-looting Soho. I've not seen as many art interventions in public spaces I imagined at the beginning of the pandemic. Is that something people in Chicago are doing? Is that kind of, because, and I'm also imagining your projects are also in these, they're kind of like public interventions already. Thinking about how Nick is working with the different kitchens and the different restaurants and bringing all the artists, bringing all these different participants together. And also the QUARANZINE project that Mark, you displayed out in public as a way to distributing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's very, very little public creativity that doesn't take fairly predictable forms. And, you know, I mean, graffiti is like has its own kind of conventions at this point. Yeah, I don't really see that like a ton of this happening in Chicago. I mean, one of the things that I find that's like quite influential, I don't know if it's hugely influential, but it's an interesting model to me for something like QUARANZINE is there's a one-page, like double-sided color laser printed or inkjet printed publication that I've seen a couple times in the city called Truth Exhibits. Truth Exhibits is fucking insane. Okay, I mean, it's like it's made by someone who you know, like has some real stuff going on. A lot of it is about how the person believes like Kim Fox is killing children, you know, or all kinds of like different constitutional issues. But what I love about Truth Exhibits, I suspect they print maybe 25 copies of each issue or something. And if you're really lucky, you'll see one taped to a bus shelter or like a utility pole or something. But the person who does this also has a Truth Exhibits Twitter account where they take a photo with their cell phone of each finished issue, like these terrible quality photos, and they publish online on Twitter after having made a collaged and printed, crazily designed publication. So this is, I mean, like the cheapest, most desperate kind of form of publishing I've maybe seen, but it has like a coherent visual identity. And like, if you've seen it, like you would remember it. So I'm looking at Jody Shapiro's comment. You know, and that's like, that to me, that's like that's an inspiring model. That's someone working with what they have. They're not looking for institutional support. They're not writing grants. Like they bought a $150 crappy printer at Best Buy or something, and that's their publishing house. Like I have a Risograph, which is nice, but I mean, like you could go buy a laser printer, black ink laser printer, and print on like the backs of junk mail that you still receive without ever leaving your house, like, and that could be your publishing house, you know. So yeah, I mean, I'm always looking for people who have just kind of taken it upon themselves to insert things into public city spaces. But most of the forms I see are pretty predictable. And now is like a really interesting time to be putting things out in the world, because cities are like quieter, or certainly they've been a lot quieter throughout the pandemic. And I felt like when I posted something in Alley, like someone probably would stop and read it, because like you would actually notice something different entering your, you know, field of vision, because you're not dodging people and cars and bicycles and all this other stuff in the city. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that a lot of the quarantine times contributions that like sort of engaged public space, it was often about how empty there were, and there was all this sort of whatever negative space to sort of fill or just observe. I guess that all feels pretty long ago now, because then the streets were and had continued to be filled with creative responses to structural racism and capitalism. But like in those early days, there was this artist, Darling Shear, who went and sort of like documented all these gorgeous like dance performances on streets that would normally be clogged with traffic, or in public sites that would be full of tourists. Or there were artists who went and documented the empty exteriors of music venues that would normally have like a bunch of people smoking outside. That sort of silence and emptiness, I feel like it's sort of over. I was in New York yesterday and it was crazy full of people. I didn't see, there's the whole like the boarding up of windows and the creative response there. I think you mentioned that in the comment. Like we have this window series that I would invite anyone in Chicago to apply to do with the council, which is like a solo exhibition series. And we like, as we were realizing that our opening the following Friday was going to not be able to happen, I was still optimistic that the artist Larry Joy, who was about to open a solo show in the windows, could at least do hers. And I was like, oh good, we have this public facing thing. But she needed to make a decision about going back to Korea or not, and went back to Korea. And like even just the installation in the space, which is going to require at least a few people to be close to each other, making it happen, it was like, oh, even that's untenable. But I think that there's also then this now moment where like Marina Resendez Santos, my colleague, like set up an exhibition space in an empty lot. And like when 10 people can be outside and observing these creative interventions there, that's starting to happen more. Or like some of the gatherings or performances that were attendant to some of the exhibitions that are coming up that we may or may not engage in the exhibition space very much. Like we might not let more than a few people into the space at a time when we're even getting there. Maybe the quinceañera, which was supposed to happen for like queer and non-binary folks who never got there, is going to happen in the park next door or something. And maybe some of the video technology that we're using can start to document that for the people who are immunocompromised and can't attend in different ways. And so I think people are like dipping their toe out into that. It's just always, I don't know. And I think that, yeah, the protests, or at least me, broke a seal, you know, whether or not it was responsible. And I think that people thinking about public performance and intervention in different ways is starting to happen a little bit more. I think that might continue to happen whether or not we're in COVID spaces. And we're going to try to start this residency for BIPOC queer artists in Chicago to investigate the histories of various sites and open spaces in Chicago through performance. And we'll do a lot of documentation and live streaming along those lines if and when that happens. And I'm not supposed to be talking about that, but yeah, I think that there's a lot that could happen. Yeah. That and does already. Yeah.
I think I guess probably the most inspiring just sort of public intervention I've seen documentation of in some time was, I guess it was earlier in the week or last week, when protesters decorated the district attorney's building in Salt Lake City after a decision that released police from the responsibility from a murder committed of a robbery suspect who was running away, who was shot at like 30-something times and killed. And I mean, I would love to see the execution of this action because the energy of it was incredible. I mean, it's, if you look it up, you'll find it. I mean, they absolutely covered the outside of the building with flyers and red paint all over everything, like fake bloody handprints on every surface, posters, flyers. But with like, there's this sort of sculpture outside of the building of these two like open hands, which someone poured like enormous amounts of red paint into them. And it sounds like something that would just, it's hard to describe it and make it sound as compelling as it looked, I think, but the sort of energy and force and just kind of like amazing formal visual cohesion of what they did. I mean, it looked incredibly well orchestrated as an action. And, you know, you know, there are memorial walls and things where people bring all these different materials into play and add them. Looks like Nick just shared photos, but the kind of the forcefulness and power of it, I thought was incredibly striking and not really like something I had seen before, using just like one color of paint and a ton of things that looked like they were printed out on 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper. So this is like nothing fancy, nothing expensive. It's it just felt like pure, like this explosion of passion and concern.
Right. I think what you're saying also like ties into my last question, and maybe it's just more like, and you, it kind of revolves around these different movements coming together, right? And I was thinking like specifically about like what you guys are working on, like you're working with different collaborators. I also get a feeling that through this kind of limits of our movement, there's like these different ways that people are organizing, different organizations just coming together in different ways. And so like, are you noticing like, with just from your own work, that there's a different way of looking at like how social agency is being developed through these collaborations? Because for me, it does seem like a little like more cohesive. I'm thinking about like the critique of Occupy was it's incoherent, everyone's everywhere, we don't know what the demands are. But with the Black Lives Matter movement, with COVID, it's just a complete exposure of the system, and people are a lot of activists and artists are articulating things that are very interconnected and very concise and together. But anyway, can you share a little bit about what you experienced about what you see?
I can go quick, Mark, on some of the sort of like arts organizing responses. I mean, I think that one thing that relates to CAPE, for instance, I sit on the board of Acre still, but I know that there's now a collaboration between CAPE and Acre to help source new and other teachers from the Acre community, and that it's been able to help employ some awesome folks who needed work. And on the sort of like organizing front, just before the Floyd rebellions and everything, I mentioned that we work closely with Experimental Sound Studio to sort of bolster each other's efforts to quickly get up into live streaming. Not success, but attempts at success. And I'll say that the thing that like is happening more recently, and then of course, so like for instance, then like the window show that I showed as one of my first slides, like the council was talking about like, well, let's make our own printing press and we'll call it something stupid like Rhizomatic, and then we'll just like make a bunch of risographs and print them for protest sign people. But Anthony Stepter, who sits on the council, was like, actually there are presses all over the country and world who are printing anti-racist posters for free right now. Why don't we just engage with them? And like, you can see, right, that those orgs are working together. We worked with Hoofprint and Just Seeds that were already printing a bunch of stuff, and we're able to work with much more efficacy. Now we have Nicole Marquine posters at the space and at the Buddy Shop that people can make donations for or just take to the protest right away. There's a lot of co-working there. I will say that the thing that's like sort of most exciting to me now, though, that's sort of more nascent, is that a lot of orgs nationally and internationally, but also locally in Chicago, are talking about like how we can work more in concert and solidarity with each other, trying to like find guidance and ideas and solidarity with each other's sort of actions. And one of the things that's come out of that is a big conversation around like how to change nonprofit structure and the way that a lot of our orgs are sort of replicating systems that maybe we don't love, like corporate structures and boards and et cetera. So like there is a conversation that I'll try to drop in the chat before it's too late, but that Tempest Hazel is organizing, I think it's early next week, around like how to find solidarity across organizing in the arts and beyond, and specifically thinking about how to work with cooperative models that kind of fly in the face of some of the hierarchies that a lot of nonprofits feel like they're legally obliged to adhere to, but they're not. And so I don't know, some of the other big dreamy things that I'm not supposed to talk about include like trying to cooperatively start a cooperative incubator for everybody to become more cooperative. But that may or may not happen, but it would be nice to, it's always sort of like a unified field theory puzzle for nonprofits to figure out how to take inspiration from and form formal sort of like organizational structure from the nature of a cooperative structure, which is inherently like for profit and people share profit, and we're not trying to be for profit, but there are hacks and people are thinking about it a lot. And I think that like massive structural, no one goes back to normal change in the places that we have some agency over can be something that hopefully continues to be looked at and actually happen as we move forward.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, one of the great things that happened with being a special editor or whatever my title was at Quarantine Times was that people like Nick, who are really great at fundraising for their projects, then gave all of the editors this pretty much free reign to select people to who would then be paid for their writing, their contributing. So that allowed me to kind of move resources over to people like Eric Von Haynes from Flatland Studio, who has been doing this printing for people's protest actions just for free, just donating that labor and materials. Or inviting someone I saw in court a lot, Frank Chapman, who for years has been advocating for civilian police accountability councils, to be able to commission him to write about the protest actions when car caravans started being used. Actually, I mean, going back to like, because I don't really care about the separation between art and other forms of creativity, I think like the innovation of people using their cars as a safe way and creating these caravans with cars covered in posters as a safe way to protest during the pandemic. I think that's a real innovation that maybe it's happened somewhere else before, but not as commonly or as widespread. I was able to invite for Quarantine Times Sarah Heyman, who lives in Little Village, to make art and interview people who've been affected by Hilco's totally disgusting demolition work that's been such a health hazard to people in that neighborhood. So having those resources available to then tap these relationships that maybe I didn't have a reason or a opportunity to kind of call into play for other projects. It was great to be able to sort of extend this web platform, which will then be a publication, a Quarantine Times publication, to these other people. And I mean, I think this is just something I think Chicago kind of in general does really well. Like, people are available and game to collaborate on things without like expectation of economic rewards, but when there are resources, like that's great too. Yeah.
I was just reminded of the most recent issue of Lumpen magazine, which there was supposed to be another one, but distributing it, well, there are a number of reasons. So most recent issue was like also heavily inspired by some of Marc's work, and was part of a series of programs around how artists and organizers and architects and other folks work together, and called Togetherism because that was the name we chose. And there's an issue that I just shared in the chat that has contributions from Temporary Services and Marc, and thinks a lot about how different people, or has contributions from people thinking really well and about how folks work together. And that's sort of like nicely something I love about Chicago, but it's including orgs and people from all over the country. So I would encourage you to read that free PDF and one day come and get the free magazine in our space or in one of the spaces it's distributed when it's allowed. And then I'll just note that the next issue is going to be about art, in partnership with Hyde Park Art Center and 60 Inches from Center, is going to be about Artist Run Chicago, and honing more specifically about the artist run spaces and their sort of network and history in Chicago. So that's going to be published in the next month or two, and will include, also inspired by Marc, a map and listing of artist run spaces in Chicago that are currently operating, and then one from 10 years ago, and an online resource that will allow people to continue to update that on this mapping space. So yeah, that's some of the, like, that's sort of the propaganda. We're all interested in how that works, and interested in how learning how we can make things work in those spaces of collaboration and cooperation and solidarity, and also like lifting up and like performing that by trying to produce these tens of thousands of free magazines that sort of help other people learn about these exciting projects, and hopefully be inspired to start their own or chip into the ones that exist, etc. So